Good evening all. On behalf of Critical Discussion Forum, I welcome you all to today's panel discussion, a tribute to Professor Saba Mahmood. Saba Mahmood, Professor of Anthropology at the University of California, Berkeley, passed away on March 10, 2018. She was specialized in Sociocultural Anthropology and received her PhD from Stanford University. Saba made path-breaking contributions to contemporary debates on secularism, opening up new ways of understanding religion in public life and contesting received assumptions about both religion and the secular. Together with Talal Asad and Charles Ishkent, Mahmood showed secularism to be a complex political formation that produces differences among the religious traditions it seeks to regulate. Against an increasingly shrill scholarship denouncing Muslim societies, she brought a nuanced and educated understanding of Islam into discussion of feminist theory, ethics, and politics, challenging views of subjective freedom dictated by Western moral philosophy. She made a bold and challenging argument to understand Pious movement within Islam. One had to conceive of a subject defined in its relation in the textual and imaginistic representation of the divines. Some of her important works are Religious Differences in a Secular Age, a Minority Report, Politics of Piety, the Islamic Revival and Feminist Subject, which won the Victoria Shook Award from the American Political Science Association. With this note, I welcome our panelists, Professor M.T. Ansari from University of Hyderabad, Professor Sasheej HEGDE from University of Hyderabad, dr.uma from EFLU University, dr.Shefali from University of Hyderabad, Mr. Nuaiman, Research Scholar from University of Hyderabad, and Ms. PRANOO, Research Scholar from University of Hyderabad. Professor Ansari will be chairing the session. Professor Ansari is the head of Center for Comparative Literature, University of Hyderabad. He was a fellow at Indian Institute of Advanced Studies working on the project Comparative Literature in India, a study of the state of the discipline. He was authored Malabar Deshiyadayude Idapadalugal, published by DC Books in 2008, and edited Secularism, Islam and Modernity, selected essays of Alam Kundumiri. He was co-edited Discourse, Democracy and Difference, Perspectives on Community, Politics and Culture along with Dept Achar. His latest work, Islam and Nationalism in India, South Indian Context, traces the spectral presence of Islam across narratives to note that difference and diversity, demographic as well as cultural, can be espoused rather than excised or exorcised. Focusing on Malabar and drawing mostly on Malayalam sources, the work explored the question of Islam from various angles by constituting an archive comprising popular, administrative, academic and literary discourses. With this, I welcome Professor Ansari to take over the session.
We have 5 speakers. At least 3 are from University of Hyderabad itself, so probably they do not need a detailed introduction. But nevertheless, I will kind of pick up from what has been handed over to me. So we'll start with Professor Sasheej, and we are sort of giving 15 minutes to the Sasheej, Uma, and Shefali, and 15 minutes to Nuaiman to follow. We'll follow that order.
You already set the term, so.
Yeah, Sasheej HEGDE is a professor of Sociology, University of Hyderabad since '98. He handles core teaching on issues of sociological theory as well as offering courses intermittently on themes like legal pluralism, nations, etc. His research is ranged broadly over sociological knowledge and disciplinary history, interpretation of modernity, and critical interpretation of dominating political language. His specialization has implicated 3 domains of inquiry: the structure and dynamics of disciplines, the interpretation of modernity, and research on normative political language. interest seems to be slowly evolving on questions of law, ethics, and constitutional jurisprudence. He is a regular writer in EFLU and has published various articles and books. He remains as passionate as ever about grammatic writing. Yeah, Shashi.
Yeah, okay, thank you, Ansari. I think as one ages, I think one's attitude to no, I'll have to keep reminding myself about where the mic is. So
You want to sit down? Then the mic can stay on here.
No. At one ages, I think one's attitude to life, death also changes. And I think in recent times, I've often found myself responding to situations of death in very, very near time. So there is a certain context in which some of my remarks are going to bear on this article. But let me, it'd be too embarrassing for somebody to hold a mic for me. So let me, if you are wanting this. No, it's not appropriate that somebody holds a mic for you to speak. You know, I'm not so important. Anyway, so let me begin with a personal note. I mean, I've already struck a personal note, but there's another personal note that I want to strike. And some years ago, I was at a conference on political philosophy, and some of the very prominent names in political philosophy who practice Indian political philosophy in India were there, right? And I remember posing this question to one of India's, I won't name, but my students who have taken the course would know who I was posing that question to. I posed this question about what would a political philosophy and intellectual history of modern India be like, okay, if one took off from the evidence of ethnography, right? If one were to take off from the evidence of ethnography, would a whole thematization on the political philosophy or an intellectual history of modern India be written differently? And when I posed this question to this important practitioner, I had a counter question posed to me. Okay, what do you mean by this question, right? And I had to hurry for a reference point for that question. And I remember invoking the name of Saba Mahmood and her work to argue that what would your practice of political theory, as indeed your political philosophy, be like if your reference points were ethnographies, right? Lived contexts of contestation and so on, right? So there is a certain reference point that comes insofar as my work and my interaction with Saba Mahmood is concerned. In fact, I've never met her, I've not even heard her, okay, although I have avidly read her. Okay, and considering that one hardly travels abroad, there was no chance of an encounter either, right? This is as it should be, for I have often been jerked out of my admiration for figures when I did get to meet them in physical person, right? But of course, from what one hears about those who have crossed paths with Saba Mahmood, I guess I have missed out on her engaging presence, and I'm lesser for the experience. But what am I going to talk about in the context of this? I want to fix on two important ideas which I derive from her work, the idea of agency and the notion of critique. Okay, and I want to speak about these two notions in the context of my attempt to remember Saba Mahmood, a path that I have never crossed but avidly traversed in my own little way. I share with Saba Mahmood the concern with analytical problems, whether it be in feminism, whether it be in the anthropology of Islam, or in the anthropology of religion, and so on. And I stress the word analytical problems in these domains. Okay, I share with her the concern with questions about what is the nature and character of evidence, quote unquote, evidence, across these fields. Okay, what are the analytical issues that confront a scholar when dealing with accounts of agency, and in the context of her work, women's agency, across contexts, both disciplinary and historical. And I think there is some tremendous purchase that one gets onto these questions when one poses it along that analytical register which Saba Mahmood was constantly also posing, while also traversing a political and a historical register in the axis of these questions, right? Now, how do we approach, if agency is an important focus of our work, and women's agency in particular, okay, how do we approach the commitments, demands, and struggles of agents? Okay, what does it mean to approach agency outside the lens of the state, right? And its associated politics, so to say. I think, and there are different matrices within which the question of agency can be posed, but one of the specific challenges, the analytical challenges posed by Saba Mahmood's work, is about this question of agency outside the lens of the state and its associated politics. This does not, of course, mean that the state and its associated politics is not a frame of reference within that position, but it doesn't self-consciously adopt the framework of agency from within the perspective of the state and its associated politics, right? The associated question, what does it mean to conceptualize a domain of politics such that its contours are not given in the actions and logic of the state, right? I mean, is there a politics outside the state, and what is the relationship of a politics outside the state as indeed a politics in the context of the state, or within the state, or across the state, and so on. In fact, if religion and politics are not separate units, but are conceptually intertwined, okay, then what difference does it make to think about politics from a position not of the state, okay, and please note, posing that question as somewhat a counterfactual question, because we know we live and exist in a context and a time when the apparatus of modern governance is omnipresent, as it were. That's why the challenge of a theory of the agent, or a theory of subject formation, okay, which while being either antipodal to the modern or far from being modern, yet serves as a prototype of a distinctive subject. I mean, the question of agency figures in her work in these deep, challenging ways. In fact, given the historicity of practices, such an emphasis on a theory of subject formation, which is antipodal to the modern, okay, or not necessarily antipodal to the modern, yet serves as a distinctive prototype of a distinctive subject, I think such an emphasis, given the historicity of practices, may seem surprising, right? But the point is that even as subjects in their formation show or even cultivate what we can call a certain attachment to obedience, a voluntary attachment to obedience, okay, their disciplinary practices may yet show how the process by which one becomes a subject, okay, is also subjected to relations of power that constitute the conditions of one's own agency, right? So agency is not only constituted in the context of resistance to power, but also being subjected to power, as it were, right? So in fact, in the contours of Saba Mahmood's work, especially the politics of piety, the Islamic revival, and the feminist subject, okay, one finds a particular resonance to this idea of what one might call voluntary attachment as part of subjecthood, right? This is particularly striking as most extant theories of the subject, even that of Judith Butler, okay, aim to precisely call into question the notion of volunteerism inscribed in the idea of the subject, right? So what does it mean to speak about a voluntary attachment to obedience and yet speak about it in agential terms? That, I think, is a specific challenge, both in analytical and in historical terms, although it's the analytical challenge for me which I think is a much more engaging one. In fact, the self-reflexivity that Saba Mahmood's ethnography narrativizes and critically reformulates does deepen our understandings of this very conception of the disciplined subject, right? Rather than making the subject as prototype of modern theories of the subject and so on, right? In fact, on Saba Mahmood's register, self-reflexivity, okay, is less a universal human attribute than a historical object whose precise form is determined by historically specific conditions of power and the forms of subjectivation that enable it. Okay? Accordingly, some of the questions that emerge, and for us to deeply take on, for which we also have particular sets of answers in Saba Mahmood's work, is questions like what are or were the forms of self-reflexivity in different subjects, in which different subjects articulated their relationship to structures of authority in different and shifting historical contexts, right? Without necessarily reproducing the dictates of the state, the modern state, right? What are or were the imaginaries and life worlds of these forms of self-reflexivity that cannot be inscribed within the logic of the state, right? What are the questions and struggles that come to the fore when one shifts one's gaze from the hegemonic narrative of the state, okay, to or the state and the projects of the state building, okay, to the struggles that characterize the lives of various subjects. That's why I think the agency question in Saba Mahmood has a particular claim to our attention, and I think we need to be taking it on in more fuller terms. In terms, I mean, these are some of the questions that I've outlined for you. Surely there are other questions as well, right? Okay. Incidentally, if you take on these questions, then you will also have to confound our modern categories or our modernist categories of analysis, even as we problematize our modernist categories of analysis, and this Saba Mahmood distinctively saw, can actually confound the terms of our politics, even feminist politics, as it were, right? Let me formulate this further. In terms of our life and work, right, what is Saba Mahmood urging us, right? I think, and the interesting possibility of what does it mean, and I think this is what I see the claims of her work, what does it mean to conceptualize emancipatory politics outside the narratives of secular history, right? Specifically, a secular history which has an understanding of time in terms of homogeneous, empty, secular time, as it were, right? How do we come to terms with this? And we have a variety of post-colonial scholars who also engage this question. For one, Dipesh Chakrabarty, right? But I don't want to engage with Dipesh Chakrabarty's negotiation of this question and contrast it with Saba Mahmood's contrast. The focus can and ought to remain Saba Mahmood on this occasion. Is the claim of conceptualizing emancipatory politics outside the narrative of secular history a goading to analyze ends, okay, rather than those, other than those of emancipation, okay, that say a feminist scholar must attend to in order to explain, understand the flourishing of human lives or even womanly lives? I'm inclined to think that there is more to Saba Mahmood than this, right? Specifically, I think she's interested to complicate further the question of the relationship between our conceptions of causality, dominant scientific conceptions of causality, okay, and secular epistemology, and the associated radical politics that come from that questioning, right? In fact, from the work of Saba Mahmood, one may maintain that in order to question the truth of emancipatory politics or to explore other ideas of emancipation, okay, one needs to engage in a debate about the epistemological truth of pious, devout agents, right? In her case, devout and pious agents. It could even be other kinds of agents, right? In fact, in the introduction, and I'm sure some of my other speakers will allude to it, to the politics of piety, it is never entirely clear how scientific conceptions of causality are linked to with progressive politics, right? Or how a secular conception of history necessarily entails a critical stance against oppressive, unjust, or subordinating practices. In fact, many recent post-structuralist writers and philosophers who question the truth, say, of our dominant scientific conceptions of causality also often abide by progressive leftist positions and so on, right? Alternatively, and I want to construct this possibility, following Saba Mahmood, one is not sure that unsettling the certainty of epistemological claims of secular history necessarily leads one to question conceptions of freedom and emancipation that are hegemonic within feminist or even left liberal imaginaries, right? In other words, following from Saba Mahmood, we can claim that probing the certainty of secular epistemology belongs to a different domain of analytical labor, and I stress this, a different domain of analytical labor than an attempt that seeks to question those political visions that have become normative within progressive and feminist scholarship. In this regard, what Saba Mahmood is telling us is that, and there I now move on to her notion of critique. What she's telling us is that the notion of critique, even, if you will, secular critique, incidentally, it was not in this forum, but in the social science hall that I remember making a presentation on the idea of secular criticism that comes from Edward Said, right? And there is a sense in which idea of secular critique can still be can be articulated, although in the terms that Saba Mahmood brings, this idea of secular critique is itself confounded in very interesting ways. So that's why the notion of critique, even if you will, secular critique, okay, can be expanded and must be expanded, right? For Saba Mahmood, critique is always a situated practice, and that's a fairly obvious point for most of us. One that abides by certain protocols of what is considered normative within a particular historical moment, and insofar as it does, it is never a completely objective enterprise, right? What appears to be horribly unjust or misogynist from one perspective may appear to be quite normative from another perspective, right? And so on. So you find for Saba Mahmood, the function of critique is not simply to expose how what was once acceptable has now become questionable, right? Both ethically and empirically, but instead, as Saba Mahmood's work urges us, we need to consider how critique might be most powerful when it is undertaken not simply to condemn or to expose, right? The implausibility of another position or worldview, but to leave open the possibility that one may be remade through engagement with another perspective, right? To be sure, this is not, this impetus to be transformed through an engagement with the other is not unique to Saba Mahmood, right? For a number of theorists have called for a radical openness to the other, right? But what is important to these theorists is that it is the ethical definition of critique that is expanded implicitly, something that in itself does not have much to do with the questioning of the epistemological certainty, of one's own worldview. Ethically and politically speaking, as Saba Mahmood's work testifies, if one were to think of critique in this broad sense, then one's openness to a radical other, would mean that the certainty of one's own political commitments, could not be so easily maintained, right? And they would need to be rethought from the context of what has been termed the process of subjectivation, which incidentally for Saba Mahmood is the enabling condition, subjectivation is the enabling condition for critique in the first place, right? This does not mean that one has to adopt the lifestyle of pious women, or that one stops fighting against oppressive and unjust practices imminent in one's own life. To do so would only be to mimic the same teleological certainty that we have been criticizing under the register of secular history in the first place. It does mean, however, to keep open the possibility that one can come to question the contingent importance of emancipation and freedom to feminism, okay, to mention only two conflicted terms here, in a manner that one did not think was possible when one embarked on an inquiry in the first place. This is a question I like to think that Saba Mahmood's work raises in good measure, a question that brings the analytically and politically prescriptive projects of the feminist tradition in some tension with each other. And in fact, in all her interviews, she's forced to answer to those questions and then she constantly reiterates the idea that for her, feminism is not just a political project, it's also an analytical project. And the creative tension between feminism conceived as an analytical project and feminism conceived as a political project is a sustaining agenda of the critique. Let me make some closing observations. I think I might have perhaps moved beyond my time. Let me, in the context of this remembering, leave you with a final thought of the work of Saba Mahmood. In challenging the evasion, okay, of our own present history and confronting the secular bias